This session inspired by the Inter-American Development Bank's recent report that is going to be launched soon. So you're going to get a sneak peek into this flagship report of the IDB. The name is Peril and Promise, Tackling Climate Change in Latin America and the Caribbean. This session will guide us through the profound challenges and equally profound opportunities facing the Latin American and the Caribbean region. Today, we'll discuss strategies to adapt, mitigate, and finance climate action, learning from the innovative practices across the region. To start, I would like to introduce you to IDB's Executive Vice President, Jordan Schwartz. Jordan became the Executive Vice President of the IDB in 2023. As EVP and COO, he manages quality control and risk across all bank operations, oversees senior staff, and leads management committees. Jordan brings over 30 years of experience in economic development, specializing in infrastructure, finance, and sustainability. Jordan, the floor is yours.
Okay, can everybody hear okay? All right. Welcome to our pavilion. We're kind of in our own little bubble here, okay? We'll try to be clear, because we also, I think, are live streaming, so we want to welcome the people who are joining us virtually. I feel like the microphone is going in and out. Is that all right? It's okay. All right, it doesn't. So thank you so much, Anna, for the introduction. Today, we, as was mentioned, are confronting the realities of climate change very much in our region. Our region, we think of as one of the most vulnerable regions in the world, whether you look at the impact on people's lives or the impact on our productivity, the effects of flooding and of drought, the effects of storm surge, the effects of climate across the Caribbean islands, across Central America, the Andean region, and the southern cone of Latin America and the Caribbean. But we also think about our region as a part of the solution to climate change, and we'll hear a little bit about this from the panel and in the presentation that you're going to hear about our Development in the Americas climate change report. We think about it as part of the solution because the region is a major producer of food products. It's one of perhaps the region with the largest net food export production exporting in the world, and because it provides a level of energy security based on its relatively green matrix, its hydro base, and in some places geothermal that provides power production in one of the most sustainable ways. That agricultural production that provides all of that food security for the region, as well as exports 2 to 3 times as much as the region itself consumes, requires stability of rainfall, requires increasing levels of investment in irrigation and in the capacity of the countries to confront the climate effects. In energy, the same thing stands. With the hydro base, of course, comes the challenges of water resource management. So this is something that I think that we'll have a chance to explore with the panel coming up. Just to mention briefly that the Development in the Americas reports, the DIA, as we call it in the Inter-American Development Bank, is our flagship report, and the final version of this report is going to be produced in the first quarter. But the analysis that you're going to hear about today, which embraces this kind of duality of the climate change paradigm in the region, both the peril and, in a way, the promise of the response to climate change, is complete, and this is kind of the first opportunity for the team that has worked over a year, almost 2 years on this product, to be able to share it. And so we hope that that you'll enjoy this and engage in this conversation with us about the state of climate change and the state of the preparedness of our region to address climate change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jordan. Now, as many of you who are here with your headphones in our little bubble are looking forward to get some of the insights of these key insights of this upcoming publication, I would like to invite the Climate Change Division Chief at the Inter-American Development Bank, Dr. Graham Watkins, to give a presentation, hopefully condensing in a few slides this year of research that Jordan referred to, and hopefully, I'm sure he's gonna honor the extensive and immense work that researchers at the IDB and the DIA team did over the last year. Graham, join us here. Thank you.
So I've worked out that if you move around, the headphones don't work that well. But anyway, I'm going to try and do this relatively quickly. And when I was thinking about how I was going to do it, and this might be meaningful for Amelie, it's a bit like a tasting menu in Central in Peru. So so it should be good quality, but it may be a lot of food, but good food. And I also wanted to start off by saying thank you basically to the editors who actually have been able to marshal together a huge team of people working on this. And just to say that this is not just 1 year's research, this is actually a lot of years' research cumulative over time. And I also wanted to basically begin with the core message of this, that in fact, climate action is development action, and vice versa. Development action is climate action. And I think that is a huge step forward for us as a bank, for the region as a whole. That connection is super clear in the report, and I don't want to underemphasize how important of that is. The corollary of that is that climate is not an environmental issue. We've known this for a very long time, but it is now a full-on mainstream issue that should be treated by ministries of finance, by presidents, by everybody. So I want to start with that core message because I think that is a super important message to begin with. I mean, everybody's aware of the fact that disasters are increasing, whether they're heat waves, storms, floods, droughts. You could do that by just looking at the news, or you can do that actually by tracking it over time. So one of the papers in the document actually looks at this. What it finds is that you have an increase from the 1970s that is about sixfold, which is a huge increase in the numbers of disasters that are taking place. And obviously there are changes in terms of the intensity of those disasters. This part of the presentation is relatively simple, right? This is not a complex issue. There is peril, huge peril. In fact, for many countries, for smaller countries in particular that don't have the economic size to be able to absorb the shocks, it's more than peril. It's a death knell, to be completely honest. It's very hard for them to absorb shocks as they move forward. For larger countries with larger economies, it may be possible to absorb some of these shocks. There are various chapters that look at issues such as heat waves that try to model what is the likely impact of heat waves over time? So if you look at frequency and intensity of heat waves, what is the likely economic impact of that? So there's papers that actually begin to look at the question of the direct economic impacts of heat waves. If you want to try and understand that, if you increase the intensity, you increase the frequency, you get to a point where you're dealing with almost a 1% hit on the economy of a country. There is a paper that begins to look at the question of the effects of storms on economic growth. One of the interesting characteristics of Latin America is that it really doesn't matter the question of intensity. So it doesn't matter if you look at all storms tend to have the same kind of effect in Latin America. If you look across the world, as you get lighter and lighter storms, or you go down in the intensity of the storms, you don't get this similar effect. So this is one of the sort of important results of the whole document and a particular paper in the document. And again, this is nothing new. I see Stefan here, but there is a vicious circle, a vicious spiral as a result of these kinds of effects. Climate affects poor households because they are vulnerable and less resilient. This in turn makes them more vulnerable and less resilient. So you constantly are affecting and driving further down into the poverty, and as a result of that, the estimate is that about 6 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty by 2030 in Latin America and the Caribbean. The logic of this is relatively simple. Poor people rely on small-scale agriculture. Climate change destroys small-scale agriculture, and there's no way that they have to be able to respond or manage those shocks, driving poverty, but also driving migration as well, movements into cities and then further on. Interestingly, climate also increases the demand for health services. So you're putting pressure on government systems to deliver health services. Heat causes distress, increases violence, increases disease prevalence. Disasters also massively affect access to health services, but also create more demand for those health services. There is an estimate that about 140 million people in Latin America and the Caribbean will live in areas where health services demands will exceed the supply as a result of climate change. Interestingly, heat also affects learning, the capacity of kids to learn. Extremely hot days affect whether or not schools are effective. We estimate in the papers, or one of the chapters, that about 40,000 schools and 20 million pupils are going to be affected by extreme heat. There are also direct effects on things like labor, productivity, and ultimately on jobs. This is a relatively obvious one. There are direct effects of climate on infrastructure. This is both slow onset changes, but also direct impacts from disasters. This affects energy services, transport services, communication services, water services, sanitation services, you name it. It is being affected already, and those effects are going to increase over time. Also directly affects buildings, homes, schools, hospitals. All of those are going to be affected. All infrastructure basically will be affected. Also obvious if you take a step back, but actually there is going to be increasing demand on infrastructure services. So as temperatures go up, then communities are going to start looking to be able to manage those temperatures in their homes. That's going to increase your energy demand in systems. So you can also track that. So we have another paper that actually begins to look at what is that kind of impact? What is the effect of climate change in terms of trying to deliver infrastructure services? It's not just energy, it's water, it's across all of the services that are going to be affected. And what does all that mean? If you add it up, you're basically going to have effects that lower your tax revenues, you're going to have increased spending needs, you're going to have higher borrowing costs, and therefore you're going to get fiscal deficits. It's already happening, it's going to get worse, basically. And just to add into that mix, if you look at the Caribbean in particular, that debt becomes persistent. So what happens is that several years after a disaster, you start seeing additional impacts. And we've calculated that's equivalent to about an 18% bump on your debt levels in the Caribbean islands, at least. Not looking good so far, right? I haven't finished. We've written quite a bit about things like tipping points for the Amazon. This is an important carbon store. It's already under threat, mainly driven by deforestation effects, but it could quite easily be pushed to a tipping point. We've spent quite a bit of time, as is the World Bank, in terms of looking at those tipping points and what can drive or actually push beyond the edge to shift over the tipping points. We have a paper that actually models what are the implications of that for the Amazon directly. Bottom line is, if we don't manage it, you're looking at losses of about 257 billion. For Brazil alone, it's 184 billion. If you do manage it, if you can go forward and you can create a sustainable system out of the Amazon, you could be looking at benefits of 339 billion. This is based on our own modeling systems and trying to look at what might happen, given, basically a bifurcation of pathways. So now you should get an inkling of what the promise side might look like. But both adaptation and mitigation actions have positive economic effects. Policies for adaptation are basically policies for development, to be honest, and vice versa. So the first point is that we have a part of the work that actually focuses on looking at social protection, trying to make social protection flexible and dynamic and linked into climate issues and based on an understanding of climate issues. Things like job training, cash transfers, health systems, all support poverty alleviation, but they also make people much more resilient to climate change. We need to expand that work. That's going to be core for moving forward, but also taking into consideration climate issues. We take a look at the Dominican Republic, which is a country in which, and there's a story behind this. I have my own anecdotes about Dominican Republic, but I first came across Dominican Republic about 10 years ago, where we tried to do a project on roads, and there was a refusal, rebuilding roads after a hurricane, there was a refusal to actually redesign the roads so that they were resilient. We have a completely different Dominican Republic now. They are now incorporating into their policy frameworks the blue spot analysis, which actually helps you target out what are the areas that are going to be most susceptible to climate change and be able to invest in those primarily. Again, we borrowed it from the World Bank, but it's being applied here at a policy level. So we have a set of papers that are actually looking at that in terms of infrastructure resilience and how you can actually work towards improving infrastructure resilience in the Latin America and the Caribbean. One of the points that an important point that the document makes is that you need an integrated and transversal approach to adaptation. If you make a hospital resilient but you don't make the roads resilient, you haven't solved the problem. If the people can't get to the hospital after a disaster, then why, you haven't fixed the puzzle, basically. Resilient agricultural systems really can't provide food to people that need food if you don't have resilient infrastructure. Just simple examples, but we have quite a lot of analytical work that looks at that. So you basically need to make sure that you're adapting your productive systems, your social systems, and your infrastructure systems in an integrated way. It's an integrated problem that needs to be addressed. One of the things that we spend a lot of time working on trying to ask the question, what are the costs and benefits of moving forward with decarbonization in the region? We've done these kinds of analyses at a country level. We've done them in Peru, we've done them in Colombia, we've done them in Chile, we did them in Costa Rica. And what you find consistently is that actually it makes economic sense for a country to decarbonize. So we repeated that at a regional level. So we modeled the future and we repeated the questions at a regional level. We find that there is likely to be directly $700 billion of savings, additional savings, direct savings, as a result of decarbonization. But more importantly are the $2.7 trillion of basically indirect savings that you get when you actually improve health systems, you have safer systems, you have greater productivity, you avoid pollution and the damages caused by pollution, and you can retain and maintain ecosystem services that provide critical services to people. So the long and the short of it is that Latin America and the Caribbean, if it did decarbonize, would stand to benefit substantially. I won't go into the details here, but the papers actually do talk about what then are the private sector opportunities, what does this mean for investments over time. So it's this for me is like one of the hearts of the study that of the whole paper, the book we're trying to present. We talk about what you need to do, recognizing that Latin America and the Caribbean is a little bit different from the rest of the world. Its biggest problem is land use and forests and agriculture. And those systems need to become sustainable, much more so than in any other part of the world. So you need to look at conserving and expanding forests. You need to look at modernizing. You need a new agricultural model, basically, of how private sector works in the agricultural systems. We need the equivalent of renewables for agriculture, more or less. You need to reduce the expansion of agricultural lands into lands that are presently forests or natural habitat. Obviously, you need to continue to shift towards renewables. Latin America and the Caribbean is very advanced compared to other countries, to other regions, in terms of electricity generation. And you finally need to make sure you electrify everything. You have to move forward with transportation, industry, and buildings in particular. So the recipe is not complex. It's very complex to do, but it's quite simple to explain what it is that you have to do. And while you do that, you need to be exceedingly careful with the just transition. Latin America and the Caribbean has high inequality, which means that it is exceedingly susceptible to these kinds of changes. The political economies of Latin America and the Caribbean are also particularly well designed for creating resistances. So we also analyze this and include this in terms of the discussions moving forward. Ultimately, we need to be able to work to reduce the impacts of the changes, the transformation, particularly on communities, on households, and develop mechanisms for dealing with this that can include things like cash transfer systems that are particularly targeted towards those that are most affected as a result of the changes. So if that all makes sense, then the big question is, why ain't it happening? Why is it not going forward? And what you find is that there are policy barriers. There are things like subsidies, price systems, market signals are not aligned. Regulations are designed for an old way of doing things, not a new way of doing things, and they need to be modified. Infrastructure is often outdated, and it's not designed to meet the needs of a new way forward at all. So that needs to be fixed. There's some really nice examples of this. For example, in Chile, the transmission line frameworks, which were not really designed to be able to bring in renewables to the market. In many cases, information is not available and it's not flowing effectively if it is available. There are governance challenges, as I mentioned, the whole question of political economies, and there are financing challenges. Just a couple of examples of that. There's the question of fossil fuel subsidies. They are a challenge in Latin America and the Caribbean. You're looking at about $100 billion worth of direct fossil fuel subsidies and about $300 billion of indirect subsidies. I mean, as a side story, it's always much easier to talk about things like carbon markets, but you've got something sitting right in your face that you could probably address nationally, which would be a lot easier to try and address, that would save you $100 to $300 billion right off the bat. But if you do that, you have to be very careful in Latin America and the Caribbean. Again, going back to the questions of inequality, you need to think about what works in one country might not work in another country. Particularly countries that have informal employment, you're not going to get much of an impact by modifying, for example, the income tax as a result to ameliorate the impacts of changing carbon prices. So in countries that have a lot of informal labor, you may want to refocus and think about value-added taxes and changing different tax systems to be able to redistribute the impacts, as it were, particularly on the most vulnerable. So there's a series of papers looking at, one paper looking at this in particular. The big question, and since this is COP and it's the finance COP, the big question is, how much do you need? What do you need? We have an old calculation that basically suggests you need something between 500 billion and 1.3 trillion for the region, not including loss and damage. This is simply adaptation and mitigation costs. The question is, where is it going to come from? So we have one paper that begins to look at it in terms of what's happening with climate finance at the moment. But half of it comes from public sector sources, half of it from the private sector. If you look at it today, about 39% of it comes from MDBs. But I was in another panel, and I just emphasized, but that's 2% of what you actually need. And that's the right question to answer, not what percentage of existing climate finance comes from the public sector. You also need to look at how much it can be expanded, what's the space for expansion, and what are the mechanisms for expansion. Debt lending is probably the most, at the moment, is the most important instrument at about 60%. There's also a very high percentage of climate finance that is recorded as going to mitigation. But remember that the two methodologies that we use to calculate climate finance are completely different. One is based on incremental, one is based on use of proceeds, which means that really you shouldn't be talking about them in the same piece of paper. They're apples and oranges. But there is a road ahead. There is a way of doing something about this. There's a lot to do. There are many actions, many policy changes, many transformations that need to be put in place. It's a huge change management challenge. But there are many Latin American countries that are beginning to do this. They're on their way. They want to do this, which is crucial. Interestingly, when you compare Latin America and the Caribbean as a region to other parts of the world, we are a little bit ahead of the game. I get some jealousy from other climate heads from the other regional development banks because I keep saying, well, I've got too much demand. Everybody wants to work on this. Governments are absolutely crucial in identifying those perils and identifying the promises, the opportunities that are there, and then trying to act on a way forward. We also asked, what do the people want? What's the willingness to pay? Those are the results. Interestingly, there is high willingness to pay. It's not quite as high as Europe, but it's high. It's high enough that, in fact, people would be willing to take the step forward and actually move forward with some of these changes. But we also emphasize that it's not a blank check. It's not like you can just go ahead and do this. It's very complex to do it. You need governments to lead, to be able to move forward, but they will need support for the transformation processes. They need to know which policies to use. They need to understand what works in Latin America, what doesn't work in Latin America. They need to be able to share that information amongst each other to be able to accelerate the changes. And one takeaway is that positive growth investments are probably much likely to be more palatable than actually using punitive taxes or regulatory controls. We also asked what kinds of things influence public opinion. Should be a no-brainer. Education is crucial. Improving the understanding about climate change. What are the drivers? What happens? What's the economics behind it? Questions like social norms. What are the existing social norms and rules in a community, in a culture? Perceptions of policy fairness are also crucial. There's a feeling that things need to be fair, as it were. And effectiveness. How effective are particular policies versus one policy mix over another policy mix? Those are the kinds of questions that need to be asked. And that's a quick run through. I hope that was, obviously it wasn't as good as having dinner at Central in Peru, but the idea was to give you a flavor, a taste for what's in this book and some of the key messages in the book. And I do think it really is a huge step forward for us as a bank, and I think it's going to be a super important publication moving forward. So, thank you very much.
Okay, that presentation wasn't so long. And thank you everyone for staying so engaged. I've been watching you all, and I see that everybody's keen to dig in a little bit deeper and to bring these key insights home. I have assembled a dream team of experts to come and give us some insights. They read the executive summary already. They had long flights to do so, and they did. I checked. And I would like to invite them to join us in front to have a conversation based on their own knowledge, expertise, and experiences in the region and discuss some of these key insights. I'm going to quickly introduce them to you in case some of you who are here in the audience don't know them. But first of all, I would like to introduce Dr. Amalie Amin. Amalie is a friend of the IDB. She's a dedicated champion for sustainable development. She serves as a managing director of climate diversity and advisory at the British International Investment, where she drives climate and gender-focused finance strategies. She has over 25 years of high impact roles, including chief of the climate change division at the IDB and senior advisor to the UK COP26 presidency, where Amalie has made groundbreaking strides in sustainable energy policy and investment. Welcome, Amalie. I would like to also invite Stefan Helgate, senior climate change advisor at the World Bank. He combines expertise in environmental economics with extensive experience in the front lines of climate resilience and adaptation. Stefan is he's very familiar with putting together reports and high-level reports. He is a lead author of the IPCC's fifth assessment report and has driven landmark World Bank reports like Shockwaves and Unbreakable, which address climate impacts and poverty and infrastructure resilience. Welcome, Stefan. And our very own Ilen Mirovic, head of the climate change at IDB Invest. She is an authority in her own right on fostering climate conducive to sustainable investments across Latin America and the Caribbean. Recognized with awards for her innovative climate finance solutions, Ilen leverages international funds to attract private investments at IDB Invest. Thank you for joining us, and Graham will be helping us kick off this conversation. This is by no means a panel, so I heard. It's a conversation, so he will start reflecting. Thank you.
Okay, so the first question is, who do I start with now? And I want to start with Amalie because, and I'll tell you why. Each of you has a reason for being on the panel, but Amalie actually started a lot of this thinking. Well, how many years ago was it? 10 years ago? More, something like that, 10 years ago. And we haven't finalized it yet, obviously, but we're moving in that direction. And I think this really is a really important step forward. Particularly this question of a focus on the opportunities, on the net benefits of the changes of decarbonization for the region, particularly for our region, which I think there's a lot of stuff that's quite specific to Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm just wondering where your thinking is today on this, having been out of the IDB for a while. I mean, how are you looking at this right now in terms of costs and benefits of decarbonization?
Yeah. Oh, gosh, it's a bit weird with the headphones, isn't it? Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's great, and congratulations. Well, no, not you, Stefan, but to the IDB group team, because I think this really is groundbreaking. And I mean, the fact that in 2024 that we think this is groundbreaking is a bit of a demonstration that, maybe we haven't brought the evidence base fast enough. I think when we were first working on this agenda, and actually, I was delighted to bring a really good economist from the World Bank. It wasn't just your blue spot analysis we stole, but we We took
I'm still a bit upset about that.
Adrien, who actually was, for me, the perfect steal from the World Bank, because he was able to help us start to articulate some of this thinking in a way that, certainly within the climate division, we didn't have that ability to engage with our economists internally to challenge the more conventional thinking. And that was both an internal challenge, but then, of course, very mirrored by what we're seeing in our governments, that those, whether it's environment or, regardless of, the ministry, the expertise, it's always the conventional economic thinking that was prevailing. And I do think this is groundbreaking. The fact that this is groundbreaking, though, I think is cause for some concern, because we need to see this becoming accepted across all regions and all governments and all institutions. And, whilst we're seeing movements in that direction, we still haven't quite made the full economic case, despite some amazing reports, including, the Stern report, which I was in the UK government when that first came out, the economics of climate change. Then there was the new climate economy work, and then, further iterations of that. And now, I think this is obviously clearly groundbreaking for the region. So we just need to really now act on this, and we need to ensure that this isn't seen as a niche, or this is just the norm in our conversations. So, and we need to see, importantly, ministries of finance, ministries of economy, also talking about this as the norm. So I'm delighted to be on this panel, and it's just amazing to be able to see the results of this. I was also seeing the Dominican Republic, and I remember when I can't remember the name of the hurricane they got hit by, when they'd lost a lot of infrastructure. And the conversations we were having with the government at the time were like, well, look, you can build back better. I don't think we use the word build back better, but we can build resilience. And at the time, there was just like, no, we just need to do it quickly. We have an election coming, we need to do it quickly. But the fact that now that has been realised, and that's not a short, I know, because I know from the team's work, that's not a one-off conversation with the government. That's building very trusted relationships, building the confidence for governments, particularly ministries of economy, ministries of finance, that things can be done differently, and actually they will be better. And I know that the bank, the IDB, and IDB Invest have a lot more examples of this, and I'm not going to say more now, but I might bring some more that I'm starting to recall from my time at the bank. Again, these need to become the norm, and they need to be our normal dialogue. So that's really the moving forward, and I think congratulations again, because it's just really, really great to see this work.
So what's actually interesting is your comment on the ministries of finance. So they are having these discussions. Again, another steal from the World Bank was the concept of having a platform for ministers of finance to have discussions on climate. And their discussions are on these issues. They're on the fiscal issues, the challenges, where's the money going to come from, how do we rechannel, how do we look at channeling private finance, how do we track our own spending, and how do we improve that spending. So that's also happened only in the last 3 to 5 years.
I have to correct you, Graham. It wasn't a steal from the World Bank, because we started those conversations. Actually, I remember in 2015, even before Paris, we had the first, it was bringing our central bank representatives with some ministries of finance to start talking about climate risk and opportunity. It was a very, very early conversation, but it was not a steal from the World Bank now.
Okay.
We were very well stealing good ideas. So that's perfect.
Clarify that it's not a steal. Stefan, I'll move to you, because you will see your fingerprints in a lot of this, presumably. And it wasn't just because Adrienne was one of the editors. I think a lot of your publications have been read. They are having an impact. People are responding to them. I think particularly, I saw you taking a shot of the climate action as development action. just talk us through this. I know you guys have published something very recently which is sort of saying the same thing, but
No, it's. I mean, I'm very happy to see this, and I just remove this because indeed it's awkward. No, very happy to see this work, and very happy to see also an alignment, because for the countries facing one day a visit of the World Bank person and the next day somebody from your shop and the next day somebody from somewhere else, I think having an agreement on those basic principles and framing is really, really important. And sometimes we agree on 99% and we keep talking about the 1% difference, and people miss the point that, you know, on 99% we're on the same page. So very happy to see this. And indeed, I took a picture and sent it to the World Bank delegation here. So that's the first thing I did. So there are a lot of things that I like about your presentation and the executive summary. Really looking forward to see the full report. You'll have to say when you will publish this, right? And then you will be committed to it and have no choice. But I really like this point on the vicious circle is really, really important. And to me, it's really important because we keep talking about the urgency on the emission reduction to keep the global goals possible. But there is also an urgency on the development side of getting people out of extreme poverty before a lot more impacts will affect them and making it even more difficult to get them out of poverty. So there is also an urgency on the development side. And I've been spending a lot of time here saying, yeah, climate finance is really important. Don't forget development finance. And we're in the process of the AIDA replenishment. So this is really important that we're not focusing only on the climate finance, but also on the development angle, and not just like moving money around. Like the total amount needs to increase to help our countries to do this. And very briefly, I also like very much the people focus, health, education, things that people, feel, understand. It's really important to put those very much forward. I think it's really great that you're doing this work, because the region, as you said, is not like the global average, and especially in terms of emissions. And when we were working on our country climate and development reports in the region, I kept saying, like, if we can talk about coal in Asia, we should talk about land use and deforestation and agriculture and diets, I should say, in the region. If we want to talk about the difficult topics, let's talk about the difficult topics. And I think so it's great to have a report on the region, because I'm sure some people from the region reading the global analysis see a lot of things that just don't talk to them, because it's all about the coal power plant fleets and so on. So having something toward them, I think, is really, really useful. Oh, and last thing, and I have apple and oranges on my notes. I think that this comparison of mitigation and adaptation finance, I have the same concerns as you have, right? Every time we're doing any renewable power plants, we count the full counts. Every time we do efficiency irrigation, we don't count the full amounts. And so the comparison is very much biased, and we have to keep that in mind. So two things on maybe comments, and you can maybe tell us a little bit more about what's in the report. But I think on the specific challenge of the region, I think the problem is well recognized. But then when we look at the solutions, we're facing the problem that we keep saying, so if you do the right ag practices and you do it combined with the protection of the forest, you can get economic gains, but the implementation is really, really hard. And in part because some systems are missing, like land use registries that would be like consistent and enforceable and so on. So I was just wondering a little bit more, how much do you dig into the concrete recommendations, those kind of like top 3 things that could be implemented? And to be completely transparent, my challenge when I'm asked the same question is the point that you made on the need for an integrated approach. Because when you do an integrated approach, you end up with 25 things. And if you have 25 priorities, people have their eyes like glazing over and you have lost them. So how do you change the development path while being prioritized with the little resources we have? Just curious if you have more to say on this. And lastly, on the finance component, and getting back to this climate and development, we keep talking about the lack of climate finance and to track climate finance, but is it really the problem, or is our problem a problem of development finance in general, and the lack of fiscal space and lack of domestic resource mobilization for those countries to invest in what they need for development? So I was also curious how you manage this dichotomy, and if you talk to ministries of finance, what they want is the total amounts that they need for development, not just the share of finance that they need for climate. And so I was just curious, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what you're saying on that topic. But very happy, and you can count on me to make a lot of publicity on the report as soon as it's out.
So, and that's what we're looking for, because what we want is people to read it when it comes out. One thing I did pull from the presentation is a lot of the work on looking at food security and agriculture and systems and how you can influence that and what are the appropriate policies around that. But I would go so far as to say we do not have the solution for agriculture as yet. I think my own view is that what you actually need is something like renewables. You need a profitable alternative that then the private sector will move through and then they will scale it. And I don't see that at the moment. I don't see it exist. However, I do see Brazil and countries like Brazil as being the place where that could happen. And there's a lot of talking about it. So I don't think we'll see that in this. I know it's not in this report. But maybe in 5 years' time or 3 years' time, hopefully, with the need to accelerate, we'll have another report which actually talks about those issues. So I don't know. Elin, I just want to move to you because you're actually one of the people contributing to the report and doing the report. And there's if you look at something like adaptation, there's a lot of focus on the public sector role, but there is also a private sector role. There's obviously a huge private sector role in the broader transformation. But if you could just talk to us a little bit about your experience of doing the work actually in the report, but then also what your views on basically on the private sector role in all of this.
Thank you, Graham. So first, working in this report, I think you said 2 years. I think it was, I don't know, it feels longer. But, so we're happy that it's almost out. From our side, we focus specifically on Chapter 12, which is basically the one on finance and trying to see how much finance was channeled from the private sector to climate. And one of the things that we did try to dig in addition to issues of methodology, maybe it's not the same mitigation and adaptation methodology, so I totally agree with you. And we see it with our own clients that, maybe they're investing 5% of the total project cost, and that makes the asset resilient, but it's not a lot of money, while in mitigation, you're talking about a complete different logic. But we also saw that there's this large conversation about blending finance or mobilizing private capital. And sometimes it is not necessarily that we're talking about blended finance as concessional resources, but we need technical assistance to be able to do a lot of the preparatory work to then unlock either blended finance or private capital mobilization. And so in this chapter, we did a deep dive of what was the role of that technical assistance in mobilizing dollar amounts for the future. And I think it's an important concept to start distinguishing, because it will help us put the conversation in a context. So that's one of the things that I wanted just to talk about, what we did specifically in this chapter. But in terms of adaptation and the private sector, I think it's important to recognize that, first of all, not all private sector is the same. So there are different types of private sector. We are talking about maybe private sector that are startups and service and products providers that serve adaptation. And in that case, we can talk about a company like Quilimo, that basically looks at ways to be more efficient in the drip irrigation in different parts of Latin America. And that's a company that started by thinking about what was the service that they could provide in the context of climate. So it's a climate tech, basically. So that's one thing, and that's one of the roles that the private sector can have. And as those in IDB Lab and many platforms right now that are trying to generate that type of technologies, climate tech technologies, are coming up. Interestingly enough, last year, climate tech had a lot of inflow of resources, but with the revolution of AI, a lot of resources from venture capital are moving now to AI and leaving the space of climate tech. So that's something we have to redirect. The second type of private sector in adaptation are the ones that are big infrastructure projects that are basically supporting either including adaptation in their operations, in the way they function. They support adaptation to their suppliers, their supply chain. For example, we have a great example of Naturasol, a company that produces granola bars in Mexico, and they looked at how their suppliers of honey were impacted by climate change, and they work with us and their suppliers to produce resilient honey. So that's a different type of adaptation and private sector. And the third one is banks. Private banks, intermediaries, and the way we engage with private companies or private financial intermediaries is different. They will look at how can they analyze the credit risk that they can have in their portfolio. And if they understand that there is a credit risk in their portfolio, they will try to create credit lines to increase the climate resiliency of their own clients. So one of the lessons is let's see that the private sector can be supporting adaptation in different ways depending on where they are in the private sector ecosystem.
Great.
And if I can
Go.
just react to one thing, because I think it's really interesting, the examples that you gave, and I'm just wondering how much of those examples would be captured by what we call adaptation finance, right? So all of the things are very good for adaptation and resilience, but they just don't not captured. We just published, I think that's what you were referring to, a report on adaptation and resilience, where we have 30 examples of private sector action and 9 case studies of governments moving. Almost none of them would be captured by the climate finance. So I'm mentioning that because I'm now reacting very violently against the idea that nothing's happening on adaptation and resilience, because every time we have all of those examples.
Can I ask, sorry, can you explain why would they not be captured? I'm curious.
So in the private sector, what we find on the examples is most of them can be just labeled good business practices, because they are just increasing revenues, they are saving costs. And so a lot of people are doing it without even labeling them like that.
Yeah.
In other cases, we see a lot of them being embedded into a more like sustainability framing, and the resilience might not be an angle that is put forward. The only one that we capture are basically public-private partnership when there is a real adaptation objective, and that's driving the system. But it's a very small subset.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, and I talked to your IFC colleagues quite a bit about this. In fact, I was talking with Jamie last week on exactly this point. But I actually think that, I mean, we have similar. We have companies, they're not self-identifying as adaptation, but we identify as adaptation. And then when we bring them through our investment committee, we will basically score those as adaptation finance, because we see that. We've also been training many of our fund managers so that they also start to identify, okay, these are adaptation companies, even though the companies themselves. So I agree with you, and I'm not saying we have to label too much, but you know, we all of us on this panel, we all of us have to provide reports that feed into this process, the 100 billion commitment per year, the doubling of adaptation or increasing adaptation finance, and that's why we're forced into doing this labeling when we're identifying. That said, and this is work that we've been doing from DFI peers, engaging with IFC as well, is we have started to think about how we move beyond adaptation finance as a measure of success. And we've been working on investor relevant metrics. So as an impact investor, we are slightly obsessed by impact metrics, I have to admit. But we've developed this framework with some of our fellow DFI peers, and now are looking at how we can assess in terms of impact, whether for people, planet and economy, actually. And so we are starting to shift. We will still do this labeling because we report here into the process. So you yourself can your IFC colleagues can still be labeling it as adaptation finance, but it's you doing it rather than the companies, probably.
Yes, but only we are doing it.
Yeah.
But when it's funded and financed by the private sector, it's not labeled. And then we say, oh, it's only public finance and there is no private money.
Okay.
In fact, there is private money, but nobody is spending the time to just classify in the right
No,
categories.
that's a good point. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
We're also thinking about trying to shift away from input indicators to impact indicators, or at least results indicators. And so in our new impact framework, we have a new measure which is basically asking, is a project designed for adaptation or creating climate resilience?
Yeah.
And to demonstrate that, you don't just need the climate finance, you need to have the indicators that show that you're trying to aim to make a difference that will increase resilience.
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of us that are trying to work through this, because you can get perverse incentives within the institutions themselves as well, which can drive exactly the opposite of what you want to really achieve. So it's a fascinating question. If anybody has any questions from, go, Abhinav. Here.
I found this last conversation really interesting, because I do think that the way the private sector and public sector think about adaptation is different. You speak to private sector actors and about adaptation, and they're thinking, well, this is about making my existing business, more robust and rigorous, office buildings stronger, and they're doing that. And the public sector is thinking, well, they're doing that. That's great. That's fine. That's part of the business model. My problem is my roads aren't resilient. My drainage system isn't resilient. My seawalls aren't resilient. And they think that they find the private sector is not funding those because they're public good things. And so that's why we see this, I think, this sense that the private sector isn't doing adaptation. We probably need to be more defined. The private sector isn't funding big public infrastructure adaptation, but they're doing more micro business related, which is good. And indeed, why bother too much about it if they're doing it? I mean, and they don't need our money. That's fantastic. Keep on.
Excellent points. And it's I think the question of whether the private sector will be funding public goods, long-term infrastructure project and so on, is not specific to adaptation, right? It's a problem for development in general.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I'm also interested in, because I think this point that you see that maybe there's, because AI, that's maybe detracting. I think what we see, particularly in India, actually, we see a lot of adaptation companies, early stage startups, agtech, fintech, very linked, not surprisingly, coming out of Bangalore. And artificial intelligence is key to enabling them. So interested, I mean, I can understand your point, but there's also some benefits too, isn't there? Well, we see that.
I think that, the optimal outcome would be to combine both things, right? But what we see, at least, from the latest quarters report, is that a lot of venture capital is going to AI, purely AI. The ChatGPT's new versions, instead of using AI for climate or for development more generally.
Okay. Now that's interesting, because I do think for adaptation, AI is a bit of a game changer, as we've seen in some cases in India. I mean, how they're harnessing, using data that they may have had before. They're now able to use it in quite sophisticated analysis that can then be provided to farmers of, okay, you should be planting that crop now, and you should be doing this then, and able to really helps farmers really adapt to the monsoon, even not even medium or long term. So it's
question from my side. I'm talking as a clean tech startup, so I completely understand you, Helen. But the others as well, right? Some companies, where you as the investor identify the adaptation, versus in the private industry they don't identify the adaptation, versus most of the funds are going to AI. So basically every investor you speak to, they almost want to tweak your technology to what they invest in. And it's very exhausting as a startup, because every time you go to an investor and it's a positive conversation, like, oh, let me switch my story around again. Well, in the end, what we're building is a clean tech technology for renewables and very rural populations. So it's just like, who is defining adaptation then, and who's going to set the targets and the way forward?
I think that's the point. At the moment, the common approach we all follow is the MDB joint climate finance methodology on adaptation. We follow it. We've had to tweak it, particularly because we do a lot of equity investment. So in some cases, particularly via funds, we've had to tweak it, etc., etc. But we more or less apply it. But I think that's one of the key issues here, because at the moment, our incentive as DFIs, MDBs, that we act on in the public interest. We funded by governments, so we have to report on our adaptation finance numbers, mainly so we can feed into the UNFCCC process. However, when we think about how do we bring new investment in, particularly venture capital, or how we grow companies and bring more equity in, and we're starting to it's a very, very different conversation, as you rightly point out. But yet we are having in the back of our minds having to sort of also think, well, how do we qualify this as adaptation finance or not? And obviously, if we see it's there's an incentive for us to qualify it. I do think, though, and this, getting into the discussions about this, the new goal that will be negotiated here, hopefully that sets a different normative framework, so that we will be asked to report more, say, on the quality of the climate finance, which will include adaptation finance, will include impact metrics as well, because that will then mean we're primarily focused on the impact that we're delivering for people, or the adaptation we're able to bring to sectors, and that's the reporting will be incentivized to actually be seeking, as well as reporting. At the moment, though, we are following a methodology that may not be incentivizing the right behavior.
Okay. I was going to ask it.
No, I was just going to say that maybe it's important then to also mention that yesterday, all MDBs, we released the outcome metrics, because we want to also start tracking and seeing the impacts of our investment, not only the input of climate finance, but also the outputs. And for the adaptation outcomes, there was a long conversation of different sectors, because at the end of the day, it will be different. It's not just one metrics, which it probably will then be something parallel in the nature conversation that I see Valerie sitting down there, that we will have a metric for nature finance as well.
And if I can, with your authorization, okay. And there is another movement which is in the private sector, a lot of new frameworks and new typologies, and so at the moment it's a little bit the confusing time when you have like 20 of them, and maybe for the actors trying to actually do things is more confusing than helpful, but this is a phase that you need to go through. I think we can start to see consolidation of those taxonomy. And by the way, they make the differentiation that I think you mentioned between when an activity is being made more resilient versus an activity that has as its main objective to build the resilience. And I think that's one of the big issue with the adaptation co-benefits, that it doesn't distinguish between the two. And so you have people saying, why don't you increase that number? And I think we want 100% of our operations to be resilient. We don't necessarily want 100% of our operations to be aiming at building resilience, because sometimes you just do other things and it also makes sense. So I think this is really important one. One thing on the outcome approach, which I think will be a game changer also, because what matters is not how much money we have, but how much goes to the farmer or the community who needs to invest it. And I will also name check Valerie in the back, because she's the best advocate for not forgetting about the plumbing, to just make sure the money goes to the people who needs to spend it. One of the things we have to be very careful about is there are some institutional governance and infrastructure things that are difficult to measure in terms of outcomes. And if we're focused really on measurable outcomes, there will be a bias toward things that are easy to measure, like I'm building a dike and I'm protecting X number of people. And if you do something on land registries and like this type of much more like institutional capacity building activities. You don't have a direct outcome in terms of the number of people, or it's very indirect and difficult to do. And still, it's really, really, really important. So we have to just balance this outcome focus with also this idea that some things we know are really important, even if we cannot put a number on them.
So before I hand back to Avinash to close things off, I'm not going to go to a second question,
no. Sorry, do we have time? What time is it? Okay, because I love, and actually at 7:30.
She's taking over moderation now.
7:30 p.m. 7:30 p.m. Actually, I'll be moderating a panel over at the Marriott on private adaptation finance. But I just had a question on mitigation. Most of my time I'm thinking about adaptation, but I do for this event, for this book, actually, just the time dimension. My assumption is, but you didn't emphasize this, that these benefits will be most likely realized by early action, like action now, i.e. you can't delay taking ambitious action. And I'm just trying to link it into the discussions here. The UK just launched it's a new ambitious NDC, 81% by 2035, which is obviously what we need to see coming out of the particularly the big G20 countries, real ambition. But I assume this is also saying that it's early action now realizes those benefits and minimizes also presumably costs of adaptation as well. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And you have to wait for the final papers, but we've actually published that paper also as a report, which we did with Rand. How about I give you a minute just to say your last comments before I hand over to Avinash, and don't steal his thunder, because try not to, but the idea would be just give us a minute on your views, and then we'll close off this part and then pass it over to Avinash. You want to start on that end?
So, no. It will be a short comment, but I think this is a critical piece of work that we have to have, as Mali said, we should have had this like maybe 10 years ago. What I think about it when I look at it and when I read it is that now I have to translate it for private sector. Companies will not necessarily read this, the CFOs will not necessarily read this, but I think there is so much information here to prepare the one-pager that the CFO is willing to read. So this gives a lot of basis for conversations with private actors.
So maybe one idea, because I think, so we have been spending a lot of time telling countries what they can do, identifying opportunities and so on, and I think it's really, really important. One other part of the discussion is to identify what countries have been doing already and have a measurable impact, and that we can tell other countries, look, this is really interesting, you should do the same. We have started to do more of that recently. We had one book on that for mitigation, and the book that we just published is the same on adaptation with case studies. And I think if we all want a collection of case studies of things that work and can be replicated, it's one of those things that we could also try to do together so that we don't replicate that work, because I think it makes sense to just do it all across. So maybe as a next step thing to think about is how do we collect when we find something that works great so that we all know about it and we can just push that and replicate.
So, I think a little bit building on what Helen said, and actually I'm sure you're already planning this, but I think how now you take this so it becomes part of the dialogue that governments have with their domestic private sectors, so you can translate these challenges into real opportunities that can be realized at a domestic level and then a regional level. And I do believe that the dialogue that I know the IDB's regional policy dialogues, for me, are a really powerful instrument, I would say, for building trust in the type of economic and structural and other changes, policy changes that will be needed to unlock the private sector to realize these benefits. So that's the next stage, no doubt.
Great. Look, thank you guys. We probably should have kept this to like 2 hours to have a discussion, but this is an ongoing discussion. We're going to be doing various launches, moving this forward. I mean, it's a programmatic thing that's going to start now and finish, and I'll get the specific date for you as soon as I have it. But I'll close off this session, and then we're going to pass back to Anette, I think. Thank you very, very much.
Hello. I would like to ask, I haven't told you to go. Where are you going? Where are you running to? Yeah? I'm emceeing here. Okay. Thank you so much for that conversation. I'm very proud that you kept it very, very on the structure, because that's what we like. And before you go, I would like to invite Avinash Persad, our special advisor on climate change to the IDB, to kind of wrap up and frame your reflections into one very nice closing for us and for our online viewers. And for the benefit of our online viewers, let me quickly introduce him. He's formerly a special climate envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados. He helped shape the Bridgestone Initiative and global financial reforms. Avinash is a member of the high-level expert group on climate finance for COP26, COP27, COP28, and serves on the independent expert group on debt, nature, and climate. A former senior executive for JP Morgan, he's also an emeritus professor and a prominent author in his own right on financial policy. So if I can invite you to switch with Graham for the closing remarks. Avinash, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I just wanted to end with a few things that I found striking in the report, but one of the things I found even more striking is what a wonderful panel this was. What a sign of this new era of MDB collaboration. And collaboration of people in similar areas, but different institutions. And I thought that was a wonderful conversation that could have continued for a while. Fantastic. Let's keep it. And I think we're getting insights, much more powerful insights as a result of this collaboration, more refined views about what we need to do and what the challenges are. So COP29, 32 years, is it, since the Rio Convention? We haven't mitigated enough, we've not adapted enough. But what's also very interesting that over those 32 years, I think the problem has changed. And I think one of the striking things I found in speaking to the authors of the report and then reading the report is that the promise has changed quite substantially in just the last maybe 10 years. The report shows that if Latin America goes to net zero in 2050, as hopefully it goes there before, but there would be a net economic benefit of $2.7 trillion, of 50% of GDP. Just 10 years ago, we were talking about trade-offs, about the costs, and I think a striking conclusion from this report is, this is the best economic growth plan that there is, often for our countries. And at a time when our countries are seeing regression on some of the poverty signs, especially after COVID, at a time when some of our countries are experiencing the middle income trap. So the fact that there's this very alluring growth strategy is really very attractive. So then the question is, why are we not doing it more rapidly? And I think the report highlights two things. One, that we are all sort of experts in the issue of finance, the cost of capital. I do think that, sometimes the cost of capital thing is being confused a bit as simply an issue of local risk. The reason why the cost of capital is high in developing countries, to me, it's almost by definition, they don't have a lot of cash. That's why they're developing countries. They don't have a lot of cash, and they've got enormous investment requirements. High investment requirements, low savings, high cost of capital. But the interesting thing about that is that's why pouring more local currency funding actually would be counterproductive. It actually will lead to a higher cost of capital. So we have to do our continued MDB work in developing local savings, mobilizing that stuff, but recognizing that if we want much more investment, we're going to have cross-border finance. We're going to have to get that channel of where capital is abundant to flowing to where it is scarce, and looking at all the blockages, and looking at some of those macro as well as micro blockages. But then I want to end by saying that one of the things the report highlights is that we can't do this. MDBs, we are often sort of project financiers. We're structured by thinking about loans and individual loans. We can't do this one loan at a time. We have to be systematic. Resilience is a systemic thing. A resilient bridge and non-resilient roads to the bridge is useless. But as we know, getting joined up government with single plans is extremely difficult. It's not even easy to do that in rich countries. It's not easy to do that where institutions are old and solid and well respected, as opposed to emerging places where there are even more challenges. And so I think that's why country plans, and I have to say, country plans is one of those things that have become a cliche. Everyone talks about a country plan. It's beginning to be like everything to everybody. And so for a while I was a bit confused. But when I read that report, I realized, that's what a country plan is. It's actually a sort of single plan as how we do this in a joined up way. And if we have that plan, it makes it easier for the other MDBs, without actually having a lot of effort in collaborating with each other. We can see the country has a plan. You're doing that bit and I'm doing this other bit. But even though we're doing separate bits, they're connected with the plan. So that climate governance is how it's described in the report. It's difficult. Development governance is difficult. This isn't new. And I think one of the points you've been making, which is an important one, and I think this report concludes that. Climate used to be different, but actually it's all part of development, and it's become much more clear in recent times. And that's why we need these plans, and we need not just the finance, not just the lower capital costs, but this governance. And ultimately, that's about leadership, and we need more leadership. So thank you very much. Thanks for all of your help and support, and thank you for coming.